Hey guys, it's Bree here with Blossom and Branch Farm, and today we're planting sunflowers and we're going to show you some of the tricks that we use as flower farmers to grow them. So behind me here is Caroline, and Caroline is getting our row ready where we're going to be planting our sunflowers. One of the things that we are doing this year is we are actually planting our sunflowers into our daffodil row. So by planting into the daffodil row, it's helping us to really utilize our space efficiently, because otherwise the daffodil row is going to be a space that is unused. So as we let the daffodil foliage kind of die down, we have to leave it in place so that the daffodils get enough energy to bloom for next year. So that means we can't pull that foliage out early. So what we do instead is we plant around it. So we're planting our sunflowers in the daffodil foliage itself. So what Caroline is doing here is she's actually straightening out all of the foliage so that it's all running in one direction. That's gonna help give us a little bit of exposed soil where we're gonna plant our sunflower seeds in. Now this works really well, especially in our daffodil row, because daffodils over the summer like to have drier conditions. So if we were to plant an annual here that likes a lot of water, it would be problematic because we'd have to be watering this area a lot, and the daffodil bulbs don't like that. It could rot them out, it could impact their blooms for next year. So we want something that's fairly drought tolerant, so sunflowers are a great option. Sunflowers are pretty drought tolerant, which means we really only need enough water to get them growing, and then they grow pretty well without a lot of additional water. So this makes them perfect for planting over our old daffodil rows. Now, spacing is something that we have learned over the years that we do a little bit differently than what is recommended on the packet. So as you can see here, this is a sunflower that's grown on its own here in the middle of our little pocket prairie, and sunflowers will do that, they will reseed. But as you can see, this one is growing pretty girthy, it's pretty happy and large. This is great, however, it's not always necessarily the best thing when we're talking about growing sunflowers for cut flowers. A lot of this depends on the individual farmer. Some farmers actually like having huge sunflowers to sell in bouquets. I don't particularly like to grow huge sunflowers. I really prefer to grow smaller, more manageable sunflowers for a couple reasons. One reason that I like to grow smaller sunflowers is that it makes them much more manageable for bouquet work. So because we do a lot of retail bouquets, the large sunflowers have a couple problems. One is that they tend to put their heads facing downward, especially the larger that they get, the heavier and droopier the heads get, which means they face down, which can make them really hard to use in market bouquets. The other problem with really huge sunflowers is that they're hard to work into a bouquet. So instead, what we like to do is we plant them more tightly. We space the seeds more closely together. I like to do a spacing of about 2 to 3 inches on our sunflowers versus what's recommended on the packet, which is usually closer to 6 inches. This means we're gonna get smaller, more manageable, and dainty blooms. Now, there are lots of different varieties of sunflowers, and one of the ones that tends to be grown often by flower farmers is a pollenless variety of sunflower. That's because pollen in a bouquet can be problematic. If you're using them for bridal bouquets, or if you're using them for a special event where they're going to be sitting on a tablecloth, sunflowers can drop a lot of pollen. Pollen can actually stain pretty badly. So there's a big market for pollenless sunflowers. Those ones are not going to drop pollen on the table. And also they're usually bred for cut flower production. So for example, the Pro Cut variety, which is bred for flower production, it only makes 1 flower per stem. And those flowers tend to be pointing a little bit more upright. They also tend to be pollenless. So a lot of flower farmers grow that. And we do grow some of those here at the farm too. Some of my favorites are Pro Cut Plum. I also like the White Light, which is kind of a whiter sunflower, but we do also grow the pollen varieties as well. And I grow the pollen varieties because I like to be able to feed the bees a little bit with my sunflowers, and also because they produce seed. So if I want to save seed, I use pollen varieties. And there are 2 main types of sunflowers. There's single stem sunflowers and there's branching sunflowers. Branching sunflowers are just what they sound like. They put off a bunch of different branches of stems. So usually you'll get 1 main shoot and some side shoots. Those can be great if you have a smaller space in which to grow your sunflowers, because you can usually get lots of flowers off of 1 main stem. Those branching sunflowers tend to get really tall. They get quite large, so they can take up quite a lot of room in your garden. Single stem sunflowers, on the other hand, will only give you 1 main shoot. So you need to know which type it is, because if you get a single stem variety sunflower and you pinch it or something eats the top off, you're not going to get a bloom from that sunflower. So it's important to know which kind you're growing. Also, side note, we don't pinch our sunflowers. The branching sunflowers are going to branch naturally on their own. And if we pinch a single stem, you're not going to get a bloom. In terms of growing conditions, we mentioned that sunflowers really don't need much. They actually don't need a lot of water. They don't need a lot of fertilizer, but they do need full sun. So the more sun you get, the nicer, fuller blooms you're going to get. They will grow in part shade, but the stems will be a little bit thinner and they'll be a little bit floppier. One cool fact about sunflowers is that they're actually used for remediation of removing heavy metals and other contaminants from the soil. So for example, they've been used in Chernobyl to help remediate radiation. So if you have an area of your garden that you know has heavy metals, maybe you've spilled some chemicals there before, or there's something you want to help remove from the soil, sunflowers are a great option. You can see our sunflowers actually got hit with hail, and they do have a little bit of insect damage. I really don't worry about it too much with sunflowers. They're really resilient, and even if they have their leaves nibbled on a little bit, they bounce back and they still bloom quite well. But here you can see the spacing that we tend to plant them at. They are pretty close. So when we're planting our sunflower seeds, I like to do a couple things. Number one is I succession plant. That helps to give us different bloom times. So if we were to plant all of these sunflower seeds at one time, we would suddenly get a bunch of sunflowers at once, and then we wouldn't have any the following week. So it's best to succession plant these. So every week staggers the bloom period just enough that you'll continually get blooms. So we'll usually succession plant about 1 round per week. And on the seed packet, what you'll see usually is a days to maturity. So on this one, we have 50 to 60 days to maturity. So for these Pro Cut plums, it's telling us 50 to 60 days to maturity. So it's going to be 60 days if the temperatures are a little bit cooler, 50 days if the temperatures are a little bit warmer and we have more sunshine. But sometime within that window is when you're going to get blooms from the time that you seed. Now, if you're starting them inside, you'll usually get them a little bit later than that, just because there's a little bit of transplant shock that happens with sunflowers. This is another reason why we direct sow them into the ground. They just tend to do better. Otherwise, they're subject to that transplant shock. If we know that we're gonna have blooms about 50 to 60 days from when we seed, we time backwards. So for me, I like to have sunflowers in the fall. They're a bit of a fall flower to me, and so I like to plant them later in the season. Right now it's the end of June, which means if we plant our first succession now, we'll be coming into our first blooms in the end of August. We'll succession plant so that we have them for the next 5 weeks into the end of September. So because we do a tight spacing, we're actually doing little furrows. And furrows is just gonna help save us a little bit of time, because what we do is we dig out one nice long row and we drop our seeds in instead of making individual holes. It's just a faster way of planting a lot of sunflowers. When we're planting sunflowers, I actually prefer to direct sow them. They tend to do much better. They're much healthier. They tend to thrive more, they survive better if we just direct sow them into the ground and don't waste space indoors on seed starting them. However, that can come with some issues like bunnies liking to eat them. So here's what we do for that. Behind me, you can see what we've done is we have laid out some frost fabric over the top of the seeds that we just put in. We do this because we have pretty heavy bunny pressure here at the farm. Those bunnies are the #1 threat of my sunflower seeds. So sunflower seeds can get nibbled by a lot of different things, mice, bunnies, birds will even dig them up, squirrels will dig them up and eat them. So this is a good way of protecting them. But we do use a really lightweight frost fabric because we don't want anything that's too opaque. If we use something that's too opaque, it's going to be a breeding ground for things like earwigs, and that's going to have its own repercussions on the seedlings. So we like to use a really lightweight frost fabric. It's the lightest weight frost fabric we can get, and this is what we use to protect our seedlings as they're germinating. I hope this video was helpful in learning a little bit about how we grow sunflowers here as flower farmers, and I hope some of these tips are ones that you can take home and apply to your home garden. We'll see you around here next time at the farm.